Hello, my name is Erin Suddeth, and I'm the manager of the Title I Part A Support and Improvement Branch at the Kentucky Department of Education. In this webinar, we're going to be discussing how the diagnostic tools in the Comprehensive Improvement Planning Timeline relate to the Title I Part A program. This webinar will include a brief overview of Title I Part A, information on allowable and approvable expenditures, and a look at Title I as it relates to the Comprehensive Improvement Timeline diagnostic tools, including district and school assurances, needs assessments, comprehensive improvement plans, progress monitoring, the English Learner Plan or LAU plan, and the Professional Development Plan. Title I Part A is one of the largest federal programs supporting elementary and secondary education. The supplemental resources provided by Title I Part A help ensure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. Support and resources are provided to achieve proficiency on challenging state academic achievement standards and assessments, and resources are targeted to districts and schools in the greatest need. Title I Part A is part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, of 1965, and it was most recently reauthorized by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, of 2015. Title I Part A is meant to be a school-based program, and that's so that schools can make decisions about what services will most influence their student outcomes. This means that the majority of Title I funds should be allocated to participating schools. Title I expenditures and services should be needs-based, and the school-level staff have a more detailed understanding of their specific needs. Consultation between the district and its schools is required during the development of the Title I application, as well as the implementation and evaluation of the program. Now, this consultation is ongoing, which allows the district and schools to adjust programs as necessary. The district should support schools with program implementation, making sure that expenditures are allowable, ensuring funds are spent in a timely fashion, evaluating the effectiveness of programs, etc. Before we get into how the Comprehensive Improvement Planning diagnostic tools relate to Title I-A, we need to quickly discuss the spending of Title I funds. Now, when we're talking about making purchases with federal funds, you'll hear the word allowable thrown around a lot. Is such and such an allowable purchase? You can check the allowability of items by using the funding matrix. Title I Part A is on the non-competitive federal funding matrix. And what you'll see when you look at that document in the Title I column is that not every object code has a simple yes or no in terms of allowability. Many of these codes are dependent upon other factors, and that's where we get into a specific purchase being approvable. Uniform Grant Guidance, which is the set of grant management rules that apply to all federal dollars, states that purchases must be reasonable, allocable, necessary, and adequately documented. These requirements are often referred to as RAND. A cost is reasonable if it does not exceed an amount which would be incurred by a prudent person for the same reason. So the cost should not be excessive in amount. An allocable cost aligns with and supports the intent of the program. Now, thinking back to the program intent and purpose that I shared on the previous slide, that means that items purchased with Title I funds should support improving achievement. A necessary cost is one that the program cannot operate without. When we think about something being necessary, we also need to consider staff knowledge and capacity to use something. A particular program may seem essential, but if no one knows how to use it and there are no plans to provide any sort of training for that program, then it's not necessary. The district must be able to demonstrate through documentation that a purchase is reasonable, necessary, and allocable. Districts are required to have written procedures outlining how they determine purchases are allowable and approvable. The KDE resource linked on this slide provides some guiding questions which can help districts craft their own procedures. So keep these RAND requirements in the back of your mind as we begin discussing the Comprehensive Improvement Planning diagnostics. The Comprehensive Improvement Planning Timeline outlines a collaborative process involving multiple stakeholders to develop district and school improvement plans and implement those plans with fidelity. Now, this process and the timeline are outlined in 703 KAR 5225. Title I Part A is one of the programs that should be involved in this process. The needs and strategies identified during the improvement planning process must relate directly to how districts and schools spend their Title I funds. When developed through a collaborative process involving multiple stakeholders and implemented with fidelity, the tools developed cultivate an environment that promotes student growth and achievement. Through this intentional process, schools and districts identify priority needs, strategically allocate resources, and monitor results to meet the needs of all students and close achievement gaps among identified subgroups. Although this presentation is focused on Title I Part A's relationship to the comprehensive improvement planning process, these same concepts apply to other federal funding sources as well. Other title programs such as Titles 2, 3, 4, and 5 may be used to support various needs identified during the process. This is the improvement planning timeline, which is available on our comprehensive improvement planning webpage, which was linked on the previous slide. You can see that the timeline is broken down into 4 phases, and there are different diagnostic tools that districts and schools should be working on during each phase. Oftentimes, the same type of diagnostic is required at both the district and the school level during a particular phase. Diagnostics are completed in the Cognia Continuous Improvement Platform. Phase 1 is between August 1st and October 1st, and that is where districts and schools are working on their continuous improvement diagnostics as well as their executive summaries. Schools are also working on their school safety reports during this phase. Phase 2 is October 1st through November 1st. Both districts and schools are working on their needs assessments, their individual assurances, and districts are working on the district safety report. Phase 3 is November 1st through January 1st. This is where districts and schools are working on their comprehensive improvement plans, their CDIP and their CSIP. And the district is also working on the superintendent gap assurance. Phase 4 is January 1st through December 31st. During this time, the district is working on the non-traditional instruction continuation of learning plan, the English learner plan or LAU plan, and both districts and schools are working on their professional development plans as well as progress monitoring. When preparing for Title I Part A monitoring, KDE staff reviews several of the diagnostic tools in this timeline. All of the tools provide information and insight about the district or school, but some tools have a more direct connection to Title I Part A than others. The needs assessment, CDIP, and CSIP are always reviewed. Additional diagnostics such as the professional development plan and the LAU plan may be reviewed depending on how the district or school is using its Title I funds. Progress monitoring is also an important part of Title I Part A program implementation. As we look at some of these tools today, we won't be following the order of the timeline exactly. We're going to start with the needs assessment and improvement plans, followed by progress monitoring, and then we'll circle back to district and school assurances before moving on to the tools that may be related to Title I, the LAU plan, and the PD plan. When we think about planning the Title I program, it all starts with the needs assessment. The needs assessment precedes the development of strategic goals. This tool utilizes multiple data sources to determine the current state of the district or school, as well as the processes, practices, and conditions that contributed to that state. It provides the framework to clearly and honestly identify the most critical areas for improvement that will be addressed during the planning process. The needs assessment is the starting point for goals, objectives, strategies, and activities. ESSA Section 1114B6 states that schools operating school-wide programs must base those programs on a comprehensive needs assessment. Now you'll notice that the word must is in bold, indicating that this is a legal requirement. The majority of schools in Kentucky which receive Title I funds are operating school-wide programs. For this presentation, we are focusing on the official needs assessment, the one that is completed in the Cognia Continuous Improvement Platform. But the Title I program may include additional, more informal needs assessments as well. A school may conduct a needs assessment with parents to determine how parent and family engagement funds should be spent. The district Title I coordinator may collaborate with the homeless liaison to develop a needs assessment, which helps them determine the best uses of the required homeless set-aside funds. Although these documents aren't stored in a platform like Cognia, districts and schools utilizing them should maintain them as a part of their record retention process in the event that they're selected for monitoring. CFR 200.403A states that for a cost to be allowable, it must be necessary for the performance of the program. Now, this citation comes from that uniform grant guidance that I mentioned earlier. And remember that these are requirements that apply to all federal grant funds, which includes Title I Part A. As I mentioned earlier, Title I Part A is a needs-based program. The slide contains a few guiding questions to help you ensure that all of your expenditures are needs-based, such as, could the cost be deemed necessary for the operation of a quality, efficient Title I Part A program as outlined in the district's Title I Part A application? Is the need for the cost supported in the needs assessment, the CDIP or CSIP, or a statement in the Grant Management Application and Planning System or GMAP application? And what example or examples could be provided to any auditor to document the cost as necessary? When a district Title I coordinator calls or emails their Title I consultant to ask if a particular cost is allowable, one of the first questions that the Title I consultant is probably going to ask is this in your needs assessment? The needs assessment itself and its supporting documentation supports the assertion that a particular expense was necessary for effective program implementation. Consider a school that has identified reading or literacy as a high priority need. When we look at that school's data, we should see evidence that the reading scores are below state averages. When we review the district's GMAP application, we wouldn't be surprised to see things like staff, for example, reading teachers or additional paraeducators to work with students in small groups. Maybe materials that support reading instruction or software designed to increase literacy. Maybe professional development opportunities related to reading, etc. These aren't the only allowable expenditures, they're just a few examples. But we can see a clear connection there between the data, the identified need, and the expenditures. So let's think about the flip side of that. Let's consider that same school with literacy and reading as the identified need. But imagine that they purchased math manipulatives, personnel to provide a STEM class, and fees associated with training on trauma-informed care and social emotional learning. It's not that those purchases are unallowable, it's that they aren't tied to the identified needs of the school. The first field to complete on the school needs assessment relates to protocol, the steps taken by the school during the needs assessment process. The subsequent fields relate to the information discussed during the process, reviewing the previous plan, analyzing data to identify trends, areas of strengths and weaknesses, etc. The instructions for completing this section are on the slide. So the instructions say to clearly detail the process used for reviewing, analyzing, and applying data results to determine the priorities from this year's needs assessment. Include names of school councils, leadership teams, and stakeholder groups involved, a timeline of the process, the specific data reviewed, and how the meetings are documented. One thing we talk a lot about in the Title I world is effective documentation. The evidence a district or school saves should tell the story of what happened. If something has been listed in the protocol section as part of the needs assessment process, you should be able to prove that it happened. Title I Part A is a large program with a lot of requirements. If you look at our monitoring checklists, which are available on our webpage, you'll see a lot of indicators listed along with required and suggested documentation for each indicator. Now, at first glance, it may seem very overwhelming. However, some of that documentation is stuff that the district or school should already be maintaining through things like the improvement planning process. So let's look at a few examples of documentation that are related to the needs assessment. Obviously, the completed needs assessment itself is one piece of documentation. If your needs assessment references meetings to review, analyze, and discuss data, do you have the appropriate documentation to support that? A dated meeting agenda and accompanying minutes, along with a list of attendees or a sign-in sheet, provide documentation that the meeting occurred as stated. If a survey was used to gather feedback, you should save a copy of the survey and accompanying results. A review and discussion of survey results should be documented in your meeting minutes. It may also be a good idea to document how the survey was shared, a copy of an email with an explanation and the survey link, a screenshot of where the survey was posted on the web page or social media. And again, these are just examples of some of the pieces of supporting documentation that we've seen when monitoring districts. In addition to the data used to inform the needs assessment, you should also have evidence that the data was analyzed. Some districts and schools have standard templates that they use for these types of meetings to help guide the discussion. This information could also be incorporated into your meeting minutes. When we think about the data analysis, it's important to consider the remaining components of the needs assessment as they focus in on the data. The remainder of the needs assessment tells us what we found as we carried out the protocol. First is a review of the previous plan. Consider the plan that was implemented during the previous year. What was successful? What wasn't successful? How does this inform the plan for the current school year? Obviously, you'd want to reevaluate and tweak unsuccessful initiatives and continue successful ones. If something paid for with Title I proved to be unsuccessful, we shouldn't see districts and schools continuing to pay for that item with Title I funds year after year. Think back to the RAND requirements as they relate to an ineffective product or service. Is it reasonable to spend money on something which has been proven ineffective? Does that meet the intent of the Title I program? Is that necessary for program implementation? Next is trends. Data from the previous 2 academic years is analyzed, and the academic, cultural, and behavioral measures which remain significant areas for improvement are identified. Now, we know that it takes time to start seeing the impact of a new program or initiative, which is why it's important to track trends. I mentioned reevaluating and tweaking unsuccessful initiatives during the review of the previous year's plan. The impact of those tweaks can be observed through the trends and allow you to determine if you're seeing adequate progress or success. The current state contains precise numbers and percentages about the school or district, which further support the identified needs. Both academic and non-academic information is reported. Title I funds can be used to support identified non-academic needs, such as something related to behavior. And don't forget about your other federal funds, such as Title IV Part A, which includes a provision for safe and healthy students, or Title II, which focuses on supporting effective instruction. Priorities and concerns are the areas where we expect to see Title I funds focused. The purpose of Title I is to improve academic achievement, so it makes sense to target areas identified as priorities or concerns. Depending on the amount of funds available and the types of strategies and activities the district or school wants to implement, Title I funds can be used to support multiple areas of concern. Strengths and leverages. Consider how your strengths could be used to improve your areas of concern. Things like strong leadership, effective communication, staff knowledge, and capacity all play a factor in your ability to address your needs. Evaluating the teaching and learning environment. This is where you use the 6 key core work processes to determine which processes, practices, or conditions will be the focus of resources such as Title I funds, and efforts to produce the desired changes. These elements will be addressed in detail in the improvement plans, your CDIP and your CSIP. Moving on to the CSIP and CDIP, these tools focus on priority needs, funding, and closing achievement gaps between identified subgroups of students. These are your action plans to address the needs identified in your needs assessment. The definitions on this slide and the next slide came from our KDE Comprehensive Improvement Planning resources. I went to each of the diagnostic tools in the Cognia Continuous Improvement Platform and pulled some key concepts for each term. I also referred to the CDIP and CSIP rubric on our webpage and highlighted some of the characteristics for both meeting and exceeding expectations. A goal is a long-term 3 to 5 year target based on the required district or school level goals, proficiency, achievement gap, transition readiness, etc. The goal is informed by the needs assessment. The needs assessment shows the district or school the areas that need to be addressed, and the goals outline how they'll be addressed. Goals should align with the SMART acronym, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, and clearly address the challenges identified in the needs assessment. Each goal has an objective or possibly multiple objectives to support it. Objectives are short-term targets to be attained by the end of the current academic year. These objectives should be ambitious, but also attainable. High-quality objectives should also be measurable. Within each objective, you'll have a strategy or strategies, which are approaches to systematically address the process, practice, or condition the school will focus its efforts upon, as identified in the needs assessment, in order to reach goals or objectives. Strategies are based on an established improvement approach, such as Kentucky's 6 key core work processes. Strategies should be specific and clearly aligned to the established improvement approach. Within each strategy will be an activity or multiple activities. Activities are actionable steps used to deploy the chosen strategy. The detail provided for activities may include the purpose of the action, when it will occur, and with what frequency, the audience or recipient of the action, and how it will be completed, etc. The measure of success is the observable criteria which shows the impact of the work. So how will you know that something has worked? I mentioned that objectives need to be measurable. Measures of success can be quantitative, qualitative, or a combination of both. High-quality measures of success will include student achievement data and implementation data. Progress monitoring is the process used to assess the implementation of the plan, the rate of improvement, and the effectiveness of the plan. This section includes timelines and responsible individuals. This should be a clear process. The dates of completion and the distribution of action steps to responsible parties should be varied. This means that all of the completion dates should be at the end of the year, and the responsibility for monitoring should not always fall to the same person or small group of people. We're going to talk more about progress monitoring in a few minutes. Funding is the local, state, or federal funds or grants used to support or needed to support the improvement initiative. So how are you going to pay for this item? Well, you may have some activities that don't require additional funding. Other activities may be able to use general funds, federal funds, etc. Be specific when you can, including estimated amounts for each funding source. It may also be beneficial to list the specific materials, services, or personnel being funded. Title I funds could be used to support all the strategies and activities in a particular goal, or used in conjunction with other funding sources. ESSA Section 1114B requires schools operating school-wide programs develop a comprehensive plan with input from stakeholders based on the needs assessment. The CSIP serves as the school's Title I school-wide plan. If you've been working with Title I Part A for a while, you may remember years ago when we did have a separate Title I school-wide plan that had to be completed. Now, a common piece of feedback that we'd receive was that you were essentially doing the same work twice. So now all of the requirements of the school-wide program plan are included in the CSIP, and a separate plan is not necessary. Now, this does support the fact that the Title I Part A program needs to be adequately represented in the CSIP development process. As a reminder, most Kentucky schools receiving Title I funds are operating school-wide programs, meaning this requirement does apply. Be intentional in determining what activities will be supported with Title I funds. Indicate the amount of Title I funds being used to support the initiative on the diagnostic. Sometimes during monitoring, we see CDIPs or CSIPs where no funding sources have been listed, or maybe Title I funds have been listed for every single item. In these scenarios, it's difficult to demonstrate how needs are informing Title I purchases. If Title I funds and an amount have been listed on the CSIP or CDIP, there's not a lot of room for ambiguity. It's pretty clear that Title I should be supporting that specific initiative. We should see other funding sources on the documents as well. This helps support the collaboration and coordination between programs. There should be clear connections from the needs assessment to the CSIP or CDIP to the GMAP application. The needs assessment identifies the issues. The CDIP or CSIP lays out the plan for addressing the issues and breaks that plan down into steps. The activities with Title I identified as the funding source on the CDIP or CSIP should determine the information in the GMAP application. And finally, the budgeted items on the GMAP application should inform the MUNIS budget. It's meant to be a progression. So by the time you get to the GMAP application, you shouldn't be starting from square one. You should already have multiple documents to support your application. If you're familiar with the format of the CSIP template, you know that it's a table with the goal listed at the top and then columns for each of the previously mentioned components: objective, strategy, activities, measure of success, progress monitoring, and funding. There is a screenshot on the slide for reference. There's a section for explanation and directions, and I've included the directions for the funding column on the slide. So I want to draw your attention to those, specifically the sentence that I have highlighted in bold. The funding column instructions state, list the specific federal, state, or local funding source or sources used to support each improvement initiative. If your school is a recipient of Title I Part A funds, your CSIP serves as your annual plan and must indicate how Title I funds are utilized to carry out the planned activities. That means that if your school receives Title I funds, we should see Title I Part A identified in the funding column for at least one of the activities listed on the CSIP. This component is regularly missing when we review documentation such as the CSIP in preparation for a monitoring visit. As I mentioned before, sometimes this column is left entirely blank, or other times the same funding source has been listed for every single activity. We should be able to connect the activities with Title I as a funding source on the CSIP to the GMAP application and then to the MUNIS budget report. If Title I hasn't been listed, we can't do that. Including this information is how we ensure that the CSIP meets the ESSA requirements of a school-wide plan. If your CSIP doesn't list Title I as a funding source and you're operating a school-wide program, then that means that it is not compliant. ESSA Section 1112A1 Parts A and B requires that district Title I plans be developed with timely and meaningful consultation with teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, specialized instructional support personnel, charter school leaders in districts with charter schools, administrators, other appropriate school personnel, and with the parents of children in schools served under Title I Part A. It also requires that the plans be coordinated with other programs under ESSA as appropriate. This could include the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Career and Technical Education Act, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, and other acts as appropriate. Collaboration and coordination are big components of Title I Part A. The GMAP application includes space for districts to provide narratives on how these requirements were met. The completed CDIP and supporting documentation, such as detailed meeting minutes, support the details provided in the GMAP application. So if the application outlines a standing monthly meeting between different stakeholders or program representatives, we should see not only meeting documentation, but also through different programs listed as funding sources on the CDIP. During the collaboration process, program representatives should be looking at the planned activities and working together to determine which funding sources could be used for each one and help the district utilize all funding sources effectively. We mentioned measures of success and progress monitoring earlier. The information provided on the CDIP and CSIP here will impact the documentation saved for the Title I program. So let's talk a little bit about monitoring program implementation. District coordinators are responsible for the oversight and monitoring of the Title I Part A program implementation at participating public and private schools. This includes making sure that processes and procedures are in place to verify that the activities and strategies in the approved application are being implemented effectively, as well as working with schools to analyze data and evaluate program plans for effectiveness in addressing major problem areas and increasing student achievement. The two sub-bullets there are paraphrased from our district monitoring checklist. During monitoring interviews, our consultants ask the district how they verify activities and strategies are occurring and how they work with schools on data analysis and program evaluation. Districts need to maintain evidence that these requirements are being met. The CDIP and CSIP should guide you in some of the documentation that program implementation is being monitored. Remember, these tools include descriptions of how progress will be monitored and the criteria that the district or school will use to measure success. So again, there should be a clear connection between the information provided in your improvement planning diagnostics and your Title I program processes and documentation. Think back to the screenshot of the CSIP instructions that I shared a few moments ago. There was a column for progress monitoring on the tool. The information included in that column for any activities funded with Title I Part A tells you at least one of the factors that you'll be reviewing to evaluate program effectiveness. What processes and/or procedures does the district have in place to monitor program implementation? We have two examples on the slide here. Your district could be doing something different to monitor program implementation. Although the slide is specific to the district level, the same concepts apply to how the principal of a Title I school monitors program implementation within the building. The first example is regular meetings. How often are you meeting with participating schools to discuss their programs? Is it monthly? Is it every other month? Keeping a standing meeting on your calendar helps ensure that the meetings are happening on a regular basis. Districts choose to structure their meetings differently depending on what works for them. Some meet with all of their Title I principals at once. Others may choose to break the meetings down by the grade levels served by each school. And some districts may be able to meet with each school individually on a regular basis. This information is probably already being discussed in an existing meeting. At the school level, it could be a PLC meeting where student progress is discussed. The next example is walkthroughs. Walkthroughs allow a coordinator or principal to observe a specific program or activity in action. Walkthroughs also allow you to see the physical implementation of a program, which may provide additional insight into barriers to implementation that may not appear in the data. For example, is there a device or a piece of equipment that would make the implementation more effective? Is the classroom set up in a manner that's conducive to implementation? How are these processes and procedures being documented? The first example is meeting agendas and detailed meeting minutes. If the only documentation of a meeting occurring is a short bulleted list with no list of attendees or a summary of the information discussed, it isn't very strong evidence. A meeting agenda that simply says data review doesn't tell a story. What type of data was discussed? What observations were made? You don't need a complete transcript of the meeting, but a few notes such as MAP scores for third grade students have increased by a certain number of points since the implementation of the program that you're using. That type of information provide more detail on what's happened. Regular email correspondence. Emails between the district and Title I schools may help demonstrate program oversight. For example, an email exchange where the Title I coordinator asks the principal to identify which area of the CSIP would be supported by a proposed purchase. Documents such as 30, 60, 90-day plans or Plan, Do, Study, Act tools. 30, 60, 90-day plans allow you to break down project goals into more manageable chunks, what will be done in 30, 60, and 90 days, as well as set deadlines, determine how goals will be measured, identify next steps, and assign tasks. PDSAs, or Plan, Do, Study, Act tools, can be used to organize processes into phases. First, you plan what will be done, then you do it, then you study the implementation and effectiveness, and then you act on the information gathered during your study, and the process begins again. These are just two examples of planning tools that we use at KDE, and I know that some of our districts use them as well, but there are other tools out there. Similar to keeping meeting minutes, walkthrough notes demonstrate that the walkthrough took place as planned. Walkthrough notes can then be shared with the principal or teacher during a meeting, and next steps can be determined. Circling back to the district and school assurances, which are completed during phase 2 along with the needs assessment. Assurances are acknowledgement of the various requirements and confirmation that those requirements are being met. I want to focus on the school assurances, which have quite a few items for which the school must select yes, no, or not applicable. And a large majority of the document does relate to Title I Part A. We have assurances related to parent and family engagement, such as the policy, annual meeting, compact, involving parents in program development, providing parents with required information, parent and family engagement events, etc. There's also assurances for school-wide programs, including CSIP development, coordination with stakeholders and other programs, etc., and assurances for schools operating targeted assistance programs, including the identification and serving of students, coordination with other programs, professional development, etc. It's important to read each assurance carefully before making a selection. There are several assurances that highlight the relationship between Title I and the CSIP, making sure that the CSIP meets the requirements of the school-wide plan and ESSA. If the school marks yes on the assurance, but then develops a CSIP with no reference to Title I Part A, then the assurance was not upheld. Now we're going to move on to the documents which may relate to Title I, depending on how funds are being used. To meet the requirements of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974, all districts must develop a local plan outlining how the district will meet its obligations to English learner students and their families. This plan describes the district's core EL program, meaning the services provided from general funds to meet civil rights requirements. It is commonly referred to as the Lau Plan, and that name refers to the Lau v. Nichols Supreme Court case of 1974. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court affirmed that all students, regardless of native language, are entitled to a meaningful opportunity to participate in the educational program. The district must provide identified EL students with appropriate language assistance services, which are sound in theory and effective in practice. Now, your district may refer to this plan as something else, maybe the district EL program plan. The important thing is that all of the required information has been included in the plan. You can reference KDE's district guide for the English Learners program for a full list of required contents. And specific questions about the LAU plan and its contents can be sent to our Title III EL program consultants. So how does the LAU plan relate to Title I Part A? Civil rights requirements cannot be paid for using federal funds such as Title I or Title III. Title I funds may be used to provide supplemental services for Title I eligible EL students. Title I funded supports for EL students should be compared to the LAU plan to ensure that all expenditures are truly supplemental. Activities and services in the LAU plan should not be paid for with Title I Part A funds, and we have some common issues listed on the slide here. The Dear Colleague letter issued jointly by the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Justice outlines 10 areas with common civil rights issues. And I've included 2 of those on the slide as they are some of the more common areas where we see Title I funds being used. So the first one is staffing and supporting an EL program. The Dear Colleague letter states that districts have an obligation to provide the personnel and resources necessary to effectively implement their chosen EL program. This means that the staff providing instruction for your core EL program should be paid from general funds, not Title I funds. Now, Title I funds could be used to provide supplemental staff to support EL students. For example, a bilingual paraeducator to support students in the main classroom, in addition to the services that they are receiving from the ESL teacher as part of the core program. And ensuring meaningful communication with parents who have limited proficiency in English. The Dear Colleague letter states that districts have an obligation to ensure meaningful communication with these parents of any information about a program, service, or activity of the school or district that is called to the attention of parents who are proficient in English. The Dear Colleague letter goes on to list some examples of this essential information, including IEP meetings, discipline policies, parent-teacher conferences, permission slips, etc. Sometimes we get requests through email, or maybe something is listed in the Title I application to pay for some sort of translating or interpreting, whether that is through a device, a phone service, or an actual person to translate documents and interpret conversations. When this happens, we do have to discuss what information or material is being translated or interpreted and how the LAU plan says the district will ensure essential information is communicated. Each school and district creates a professional development plan for the upcoming school year designed to meet the needs identified in the needs assessment. In this plan, the district and school identify the top 2 focus areas requiring professional development that support continuous improvement. And the following information is outlined for each identified focus area: objective, monitoring, indicators of success, targeted audience, resources, and ongoing supports. These indicators are supported by ESSA's definition of professional development, and that definition is found in section 810142 of ESSA. The definition is very lengthy, and it touches on the importance of PD being aligned with academic goals and sustained, meaning that it is not a one-day, short-term type of training. ESSA also references the importance of professional development being monitored for effectiveness. So you can see the connection to some of these items, such as indicators of success and ongoing supports. Reasonable expenses related to needs-based professional development are allowable under Title I Part A. Now, this might include registration fees for conferences, travel, lodging, and meal reimbursement, materials, or paying for a workshop consultant or speaker. ESSA Section 1114B7A34 states that the school-wide plan should include a description of PD and other activities for teachers, paraprofessionals, and other school personnel to improve instruction and use data from academic assessments and to recruit and retain effective teachers, particularly in high-need subjects. Strategies learned during PD must be monitored for effective implementation. Our school-level monitoring checklist includes several questions related to professional development. We like schools to discuss the PD opportunities that are available to both certified and classified staff, as well as how that PD is monitored for effectiveness. Now, if you're paying for PD with Title I funds, being able to tie that PD back to your plan helps demonstrate that it was, in fact, a necessary expense. Since the PD plan only identifies the top two PD focus areas, it is possible that a district or school may be supporting some other PD initiatives with Title I funds as well. This concludes our webinar on the Comprehensive Improvement Planning and its relationship to the Title I Part A program. Please contact your district's assigned Title I consultant or myself with any questions. Thank you.